Hey everyone, I am getting started here right on time, so getting everything set up, and I see we've got some people joining. Hey there, technically still good morning, so here we are. My name's Caitlin. So we are talking about wellness initiatives, incorporating those into the workplace. But a couple things I wanted to mention before we get started is a few pieces of housekeeping. So if you do have any questions for me about content, type that into the questions box. So on your interface, you should see a little arrow where you can drop down to type in questions. If you notice me glancing over throughout this presentation, I'm just keeping an eye on that questions box to see if anything's coming through. And when you do type in a question, I'm the only one who sees those. And if I can get to it or have time to address the question, I will just say somebody asked about. So I tend to just default to anonymity when it comes to the Q&A portion. So that's how you will type in any questions about content. We also have two attached handouts. So if you click on the little arrow next to handouts, you'll see two PDF files. One of those is the tech support. So hopefully no one's having any technical issues, but if you are, that's a good place to start. And then there's also, of course, the entire slide deck. So you can download that whole slide deck if you want that as a resource. So I wanted to make sure people had those. We'll also do a few live poll questions throughout the webinar. The poll questions are anonymous, so no one will know if you participated or who participated. But as all of us know, the outcomes of polls are always more interesting the more people who participate in them. So when those do come up, it'll be pretty self-explanatory. There'll just be a click on the screen, but those are anonymous. Okay. And we still have people joining. And the other thing is that we are scheduled until 12 o'clock. This will not go past that time. We'll have a few minutes at the end for additional questions, but I will certainly allow for folks to ask questions throughout as well. You don't need to wait till the end. Also, folks in this live presentation will receive a certificate. Those will get emailed to you ASAP. So obviously that's a pretty common question. You will receive a certificate for attendance of this. All right, so very quickly, again, my name is Caitlin. For those of you who just joined, I've been with Canopy, which is an employee assistance program. Some of you may be in HR with organizations that have us as an EAP, some may not, but I've been with Canopy for over 10 years. But prior to that, I worked full-time as a mental health therapist, clinician, both in trauma counseling, mental health counseling, as well as drug and alcohol counseling. But have moved to, for many years, the training side of services. And so I don't work with clients directly anymore. I'm the director of the training department at Canopy now. I have been for a few years. And a lot of what I do is working with HR on organizational support. You know, how do we support employees to help with retention, to help with motivation, to help with engagement, all of these things that we want. And so that is what I've been doing. So a lot of the examples as we go through here and talk about strategies, I will give examples because that's most of what I do now is consulting with organizations around these topics. What is working and what is not, right? So it's always good to know both of those things. And so that's really what we'll talk about is kind of what are we even talking about when it comes to workplace wellness? And what are we doing to drive engagement? Because can be a big bridge to build between creating engagement or creating wellness programs and actually having engagement in those programs. So I've seen some missteps and what works and what doesn't with that. So we'll talk about that. What are some actual things that we can do? So I always like to have presentations end with at least multiple things that people can walk away from saying, here's some things I can start right away or start working on. And then there'll be some additional resources at the end of the slides with some links to that. And for those of you who just joined, you can download the entire slide deck under the handouts on your GoToWebinar interface. So all those resources, all this information is accessible to you to download in those handouts. Okay, so far so good. So we're going to keep moving here. I always like to make sure you can see what I'm seeing. It looks like that's the case. Again, if you have questions about content as we go through here, don't hesitate to type into the questions box. I'm always keeping an eye on it to see if anything comes up. I will answer as many questions as I can, and we'll go from there. Okay, so when we're thinking about wellness initiatives, integrating those into the workplace, whether that's from scratch or doing kind of an overhaul of maybe what's been going on, it starts to be, I think, always helpful to figure out as an organization, what is our goal? You know, what is our why? And a lot of times when I'm talking to teams of HR or individuals in HR or the HR and leadership team kind of together, they'll say, you know, we wish people were more engaged. We wish people were, you know, better, feeling better holistically. And my next question is, how would you notice that that was happening? How would you notice they were more engaged? How would you notice that they were feeling better? You know, some of it's more measurable, like less absenteeism, you know, those kinds of things. But sometimes it's harder to measure. So it's always a good starting point to think for our organization, however big or small it is, why do we have a goal of implementing more wellness initiatives? And how would we know or see the kind of road marks of that goal being achieved in a more measurable, trackable way? And that's one of the biggest things I think is important for organizations is how are we tracking on whether this is working or not? And can we get ahead of that? So, because it's a lot of time, as we can see here, it can be a cost. So we want to have payout for the time and cost we're doing to implement these strategies. So it helps to think, why are we doing this? And let's start tracking on this. The other piece I will say that comes up a lot, especially with company initiatives, workplace wellness initiatives, is the amount of times I've heard, you know, HR or leadership say, we've always done it this way, right? We've always had this system. We've always had this system in place. That leads to, or can kind of be a red flag to me in terms of some stagnation. And a big piece of having wellness initiatives or any workplace changes be impactful and effective is that we have flexibility as an organization to change as needed instead of, but we've always done it this way. Why isn't it working? You know? And honestly, that's the same thing we work with clients one-on-one. It's like, but I've always tried it this way. It's like, well, if it's not working, let's try a different way. So same things for systems. So it's like, how can we get a fresh perspective on this? So thinking about those things and what are some current barriers to wellness initiative implementation? This is going to be our first live poll question. Again, for folks who may have joined later, these polls are fully anonymous. So I'm going to launch this poll real quick. You should see that on your screen. So that's just asking, you know, what is your main barrier? And again, I understand there may be more than one, but what is your main barrier to implementing wellness initiatives? So we've got votes coming in. I'm going to give it a few more moments here to allow people to place their vote or their answer, however we want to call it. And then once we get, you know, the majority of folks having answered it, I will show you the results. I promise these are not just for me to see. We'll give it about 10, 15 more seconds. We still have some people voting. Again, please participate if you can, because no one will know who or how anyone voted. All right. I think we've probably got so about 75% of you here voted. We got it. Oh, there we go. We got it up to 80%. That's good. Okay, I'm going to close that out. So 80% of attendees today voted. So I wanted to show you our breakdown of what we're seeing. And again, these polls are so interesting to me because, you know, there may be something where it's like, whoa, I thought it was going to be this, or I thought we were the only company dealing with this. So it's actually a lot of consistency across those top three. I'm glad in some ways that you know, what the initiative should be is less of a concern. It's more the logistics of, I know what they should be, but how do we, you know, implement this? So that's great. We will talk about that. And, you know, cost, time, leadership, employee buy-in. So we will talk about some of those strategies as we go through here. So thank you all for who participated in the poll. There will be more. Not to have that sound ominous, but exciting time. Okay, so I wanted to quickly put this up because one of the reasons I share this is in terms of the training side, since that's what I do for Canopy, I would say that dealing with burnout, because we offer trainings on, we have a training that focuses on employee-facing training, like how as an employee can you cope with burnout? And we also have a training on leadership, of how can leadership support employees who are feeling burnt out. And when I think about workplace wellness initiatives, I think about wellness, and we'll talk about the different categories of wellness here in a moment, of that two-pronged approach. So how can we increase workplace wellness, like in the actual workplace itself? And then how do we increase wellness collectively? So even outside of work, that, and we'll go into more detail, but like the work-life balance or things that, wellness outside of just while I'm at work. So sometimes one or both of those sides kind of gets missed. We're either thinking about wellness completely just on external things, like that could be more of like fitness challenges or healthy eating, that's going to be more of like a lifestyle change maybe in terms of what we're focusing on. And then there's this missing perspective of how are we helping people feel more well and healthy at work, or vice versa. So if people are feeling burnt out, if people are struggling, and I'll talk about how to better survey folks as well about this later, it's figuring out why that is. So again, why are we, looking at these initiatives, and are they actually more holistic initiatives that are addressing in and outside of work? So very commonly with workplace wellness, that can be, physical wellness, and that can be things like ergonomic workplaces. Many times, I'll just give one example. I was talking to an individual who works in healthcare and works at the front desk, and she was saying, she's like, the front desk is my office, and so when I am on break or doing something, I'm kind of still in the front desk area and don't really have time to decompress, have time to step away and actually not be interrupted, and those are the types of things that are going to reduce their wellness, reduce their motivation, engagement, etc. So some of it is purely logistical things at the workplace. Is this an actually physically kind of wellness promoting workplace environment? And that can also be related to hybrid workers. So if folks are working remotely, do they have what they need to have a space that is comfortable and conducive to work if they're remote? So this again can be kind of a starting point of, as HR, what do we think we're feeling really strong on this list in terms of, we've got really great equipment, kind of thing, but maybe there's other areas that are impacting their wellness. So let's focus on that. So I like to have things be more measurable, and this list of burnout types helps me do that when I'm trying to assess what employees need. But again, I will go back to this many times, is we do not want to assume, and that happens way too often with HR and leadership. There's a lot of assumptions around what employees are wanting, what they're struggling with, and what their needs are. Again, if you have questions, feel free to chime in the questions box, and I can do my best to answer those as I go. There we go. I'll make sure I can see my screen too. So we've got some statistics here. This is, these are only a few. There's so many out there, and some of the resources and links I have at the end have even more information. But I thought some of these were pretty interesting in terms of engagement, retention. Even this first one, 86% of employees willing to commit to a company for over 5 years if they receive student loan benefits. This is something I think that even now is being talked about more. One of the pieces that I'm seeing a lot with working with HR organizations is, again, expanding the idea of what benefit packages include. And student loan benefits in some capacity is a huge need, and I think not kind of as tapped into as maybe some others. And that's where it's like, let's just start from scratch here. What does our benefit package include? What are people wanting, and how much of an overlap do we have there? What can we do? How do we make this work? So I wanted to talk about that. We'll talk a little bit later about financial wellness as well. Of course, that prioritization of mental health and how we can do that for folks in the office and outside of the office. I do think that it's great to see that more organizations are prioritizing that. But I think what's interesting then is that next statistic around only 1 in 4 employees actually strongly agree their organization cares about their well-being. So this is exactly where we will get into how do we ask better questions of employees, how do we stop assuming we know what they want, and how do we actually get to a point that we are showing, not saying, that we care about their well-being. And of course, there's lots of statistics around improve, retention, reduce sick days, all of that when we have more integrated wellness programs. And employee satisfaction, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. Just checking on time. We are good to go. Talking out loud through my logistical process. I'm sure everyone's like, great. Okay, let's see here. I'm going to do another quick poll question. This is a pretty easy one, just yes or no. So I wanted to check in with folks. So currently, our organization regularly surveys employees about workplace wellness. So just kind of wanted to get a quick breakdown in terms of whether folks do or do not. I'll give it a few more seconds here. Many of you are still putting in your answers, so see how this goes. Okay. All right. So we had 80% of you voted. Let's see what that looks like. All right. So, twice as many basically saying no. So this is, I would say a pretty logistical potential solution of how do we start surveying employees consistently, and what does that look like? And also, are those surveys asking the right questions? Are they asking effective questions? Do folks feel like they can answer these in a way that they can be honest? All those things. So I kind of wanted to get up front about where folks were at or even doing those surveys, but we will certainly, like I said, get into what types of questions we can ask. So this is just, again, continuing to talk about what helps motivate employees. And a lot of this is that sense of trust, that sense of feeling valued and cared for. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But I think, again, for HR, it's thinking if we were to sit down and look at this list as a team or as an individual in terms of HR, how many of these could I truly believe that our employees could say yes to? And what I have found in my work is, and this is anecdotal, but is I would say close to 9 out of 10 times that I get a request from an organization in terms of improving morale with employees, improving employee engagement, any of these kind of holistic approaches to kind of better employee experience. 9 out of 10 times after learning more about what's going on and consulting, I recommend leadership coaching and training. So sometimes there is a lot of work to be done, and very understandably so, because many leaders are kind of put into leadership positions because they were good at their original job, but that has nothing to do with their skill set in terms of people management. So it's in no way blaming leaders. It's sometimes there's this kind of gap in education around that, and then they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. And that really impacts workplace wellness and engagement. So as an aside, a lot of times on top of integrating some of these new wellness initiatives or doing these things, one of the kind of consistent themes I see, like I mentioned earlier, is that, again, that gap between we created all these initiatives and why aren't we seeing better outcomes? Like, what's happening in between? Like, we added all these things, we invested in the cost, we took the time, we're doing it. And sometimes that can be these underlying dynamics of leadership needing more coaching around how they support employees, how they check in with employees, if they are emotionally intelligent, healthy communicators, all of that. So I see that as oftentimes one of those things that creates that space between initiatives and effectiveness of initiatives. So it's something to consider from the HR perspective. And many of you may have Canopy as your EAP. We offer all sorts of leadership services. but wanted to kind of touch on that in terms of employee motivation that I see as kind of that lost piece sometimes in HR's stuff being like, why isn't this working? So exactly this. It's thinking about, okay, we want to have effective, inclusive, and this is where we're kind of moving into talking about all these things, wellness initiatives. And I think that this is a really helpful list to start from top down at an organization. So can our employees, like a kind of overly simplified version of the earlier slide, can an employee answer these with yes? And that doesn't mean that every single day, every single employee is like, oh my gosh, I'm just like running to work. I'm so excited. Like we have to be realistic, but on a consistent basis at a like core level, can they say yes to these things? And it's also, and this goes back to that measurability, how do we as HR measure how to do that? And that I think is a piece of expanding our idea of what wellness means for folks, and shifting some of what we've always been doing. So that feeling understood, maybe that can be, we survey people more often and we are actually listening to what they want, that can help make them feel understood. They have a voice and they can say, here's what's working and here's what's not. There's a sense of autonomy. They have been trained effectively at their job. They have the tools they need to be effective at their job. They've been coached to be confident in their ability to do their task, all these things. That sense of feeling invested in the work that they do and the company they work for, and then that feeling cared for and valued. What does appreciation of employees look like? Does it feel genuine? How often are we sharing appreciation? And this also goes back to that leadership coaching that HR can maybe oftentimes implement or help leaders with, is in those one-on-ones, or when leadership, usually it is leaders and one-on-ones or team meetings, asking people for what they need or what's working and what's not. And those conversations go a lot better if that leader knows how to engage in those conversations, so that their actual opinion is feeling valued, that they are cared for as a human being. So all of those things I think are really kind of these core building blocks to making the wellness initiatives more effective. I have a lot of poll questions right now. We have 2 more left, but I'm doing a lot up front. So wanted to see, I'm going to launch this poll question. I know it's kind of a potentially more negative question, but it will help me understand what we can focus on most. So if you were to survey your employees right now, which of these do you think your employees would be least likely to say yes to? Essentially, which one you feel like is most lacking at your organization? Very, very interested about these results. So about half of you have voted. I'm going to let folks take a few more moments here to put in your answer. Okay. About 10 more seconds. All right. Good, 70% of you voted. Let's see what we are looking at. I'm sure everyone's just as interested as I am. Okay. Interesting. So that I feel valued is definitely pretty high up there. And then that invested. So valued and invested. And between all of these, because that autonomy, feeling understood, and I don't want to speak for anyone, but sometimes those can, in some cases, be a little bit more measurable logistical solutions, potentially, of like asking more questions or they've been trained correctly. But that feeling valued and feeling invested is much more about people management, that like human connection. And so it's thinking for you as an individual, however you answered this question, is, if you were an individual who clicked on the I feel valued in terms of the answer to this poll question, that next question is, how would I notice that my employees were feeling more valued? And that is the next question to ask. And yes, there may be some, consistent themes of whether it's like how often they're complaining about, and I mean like, legitimately expressing concerns about maybe a system or something going on at the workplace, or there's absenteeism, all of that. But again, for you, thinking about how you would measure improvement in that area, and why, and also the why behind that answer. Why do I think that that's probably the biggest challenge for folks? And I know sometimes HR people are like, I know exactly what it is, and I just don't know how to deal with it. Or I don't know, but I get that vibe. Like, these are all sentences I hear all the time when I'm working with HR. So just kind of knowing where you're starting from, and then tailoring some of those strategies to kind of, moving the needle in the direction that you want to. Some of these things take time. It's not like, okay, well, we implemented it today and everything's great. It does take time and motivation to implement those changes. But again, to make them as worthwhile as possible. Okay. All right, well, I'll keep going along. Again, if anyone has questions, comments. And the other thing too, I don't think I mentioned this early on. I know with GoToWebinar, it's not quite as a live interaction with attendees, but I'm more than happy to share if someone's like, this is what we started doing at our organization and it worked really well. Please share that in the questions box. Like, even if it's not a question, you can type it into the questions box just as a comment, and I'm happy to share that. I think a lot of this can be learning from each other. So if there's a suggestion or something that's worked for your team, feel free to type that into the questions and I can share that. All right, so when we're thinking about wellness categories, I would say this is that kind of umbrella term of what we're looking at. And generally speaking, for many, many years, I think it was workplace wellness was primarily focused on that physical health piece. There'd be, exercise, types of challenges or, walking challenges, all these things, and that is all fine and great, but it's looking at it more holistically. So, and I'm going to go into more detail about some examples of kind of what to do and not do in some of these categories. Work-life balance is huge, and there is just a never-ending amount of data around, especially younger generations, Gen Z, when they are looking at jobs and they are looking at what they are wanting from an organization. Some of the most important pieces is that flexibility and work-life balance. And so that's a really important category. And this is, again, why some of these wellness initiatives are very specific to the workplace, again, like ergonomic workstation, that kind of thing. And others like work-life balance, financial well-being, all these things. This is all areas of life. So how can we be more intentional around supporting people with that? So that can be a good starting point from HR of like, all right, even within these 4 categories, how many measurable, specific wellness initiatives do we have in each category? And how long have we been doing that initiative? Is anyone actually into it or not? Is it helping or not? Could we revamp this? Could we scrap this and start something else? Like, I'm very much a proponent of like, let's be flexible. Let's like scrap what's not working, try something new, engage the employees in what they want. And, that is part of that autonomy is, being valued, being cared for, being invested in the company and feeling autonomous. Almost all of that comes from employee voice and choice. So when we talk about the pillars of trauma-informed care, trauma-informed organizations, employee voice and choice is a pillar of that. And when employees feel like changes happen and they just have no idea they were happening, when they are not asked what would work for you and what doesn't work for you, their engagement, their investment, all of that is going to plummet. So often, again, I think HR will be like, this is what you all like, right? And they're like, no, we did not want to do that. So it's like, let's find out from folks first what they actually want. So some kind of higher level strategies, I have more specific examples here that are coming up as well. But higher level strategies, obviously flexible work schedules. If folks want to work hybrid, if they want to work from home, work in the office, what are those work schedule flexibility requirements and a lot of adjustments have been continuing to be adjustments for organizations, certainly, especially since 2020. And it doesn't necessarily just mean hybrid or not. It could also mean moving a lunch break around. It could mean, potentially if someone, and again, I don't mean that this is always possible. I'm giving examples, and some of these could be applicable to the way your organization works, and some may not. I worked somewhere where I asked if I could switch to 410s, and they were like, yeah, so, and that made a huge difference for my engagement. And for other people, they'd be like, I would hate 410s, but having some flexibility around that, again, moving maybe the start and end time to a day, reorganizing when meetings occur. And I mean, there's all sorts of dynamics that can help with some added flexibility. And I think sometimes with HR or with leadership, there's a fear around flexibility of, well, people aren't going to be, as like working as hard or as present. And that's where we still hold employees accountable for the work they do and the expectations we have of them in terms of due dates, in terms of productivity, however that's measured at your organization. So that is a change. And I think about it as not an either or, but a both and. Like, how can we meet you where you're at and also have a very clear understanding of how productivity is tracked in this role? So having that plan ahead of time really helps. And I think that has been something that has been a challenge for a lot of organizations since COVID, because in 2020, very understandably, it was like everyone's got to work from home, whether, like in many cases, not in every case, but in a lot of organizations, they were like, okay, now suddenly everybody's at home. And there was a lot of kind of reactive flexibility because it was like, no one really knows what's happening. It's fine if your camera's not on because no one's used to doing this from home. Like a lot of consistent rules and expectations kind of went out the window. And then a lot of times HR leadership has really been having an interesting time re-establishing some of those expectations and accountability, because for a long time there kind of was nothing and people got used to that. So when we implement strategies around flexible work hours or schedules, or moving lunches around, or whatever that might look like, make sure that you have a very clear understanding of the measurability of that, of the expectations of that, to make it consistent. So it's not like, oh, this one person just gets to have this flexibility, but this other person does not, arbitrarily. Like, we need to have some clarity around that. So getting clear on that as you are looking at adding some flexibility. So smoking cessation programs, lots of different financial wellness programs. So again, in terms of student loan support, which is a huge, huge request from folks, some organizations will do like a matching program. So they'll match whatever, up to a certain amount that the employee is paying towards those student loans per month. But looking into what would be most financially possible or resources that you could do, but that's a really big one for financial wellness. You could also have ongoing trainings, in-house trainings, where you bring in like a financial specialist to talk about credit card debt or budgeting or retirement planning. It could be anything. So really implementing in a real way that financial wellness program. So training in it, student loan matching, all sorts of stuff. Health screenings, whether that's on site or stipends or free like biometric screenings, flu shots, that kind of thing. Employee assistance program, that's us. So there's many. We are an employee assistance program, of course, and offer all sorts of resources. That is a great way to connect folks to many of these holistic approaches to workplace wellness. Our organization, we offer free legal consultations, free financial coaching. We have connections to financial and legal organizations that can do trainings on all sorts of topics, and tons of different resources. So that's a great place to, if you have an EAP, tap into those resources for a lot of these things. But there are many ways to kind of re-look at these wellness approaches. Healthy food at work. So again, every workplace is different, but if there's vending machines, if there's lunchrooms, if there's kind of food out, are there healthy options? Are there inclusive options? You know, making sure there's like dairy-free or gluten-free, or asking people, you know, like knowing if there's any dietary preferences from people. You know, I think sometimes they'll be like, okay, we're doing this whole meeting and we ordered lunch for everyone, and then you realize like half the people can't eat the food that was ordered, and so there was no one checking on like what those dietary restrictions might look like. Again, there's all this investment and then it wasn't utilized, and so that's an example of that I'll sometimes see. I'm going to talk later about inclusivity around some of these things, so I'll kind of call back to some of these topics in a moment. Team building activities. As a trainer, I personally am like, oh, I don't know, like most people hear team building, they're like, oh geez, you know, we're doing trust falls. And that's not, not the case. So being very mindful about how that community building is built in, and we'll keep talking about that. Yes, exactly. Someone had asked about potentially ideas for virtual wellness events. So an example of that could be, there are like virtual like yoga classes, so everyone logs in and can do that together. There are virtual like paint classes where the teachers like have everyone paint the same thing and they will ship that to people's houses, and so they do that virtually together. So there's like virtual, there could be like a virtual cooking class, really, you know, any type of kind of activity that can be shared that folks can do virtually, where they're live, they're talking to each other, it's very interactive. And so, you know, those can be, you know, any type of examples. We'll get to a few more later too. Yeah, so asking about how to recommend promoting some of the services to support those. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of how it relates to surveying employees, and then we'll get to kind of that education and promoting of it too. Yeah, so Canopy does, we will attend benefit fairs or, you know, on-site benefit fairs that organizations have. We also provide EAP orientation trainings, and we talk a lot about all the different services we provide outside of just the mental health strategies. But if you're ever looking for us to present, to engage in any type of wellness activities, like please reach out to us and let us know how, what that would look like in terms of integrating into your organization. We're happy to discuss how we can best do that. So that's a really good question. All right, some other examples here. You might see my cursor moving around because I want to see the questions as they come through. So some other examples. So volunteer opportunities. I worked for an organization once where they did PTO matching for volunteering. So and sometimes there can be something where there's like a list of approved volunteer organizations, or it has to be a nonprofit, or, you know, some type of parameters. But an employee can, you know, get proof of up to a certain amount of hours of volunteer time on their personal time, and can get PTO for those hours. And so that could be, you know, because we talk about incentives as well. And that could be a wellness initiative. And there's wellness challenges. Again, I'll talk later about making sure those are inclusive. Yeah, exactly. So someone's talking about how they do wellness challenges, but participation is varying on what the challenge is. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, and that's very common. So sometimes with wellness challenges, those tend to be ones where organizations are like, we've done it every year and we always do it this way, and maybe it needs to be completely rebooted. Sometimes wellness challenges can feel a little bit outdated. And so it's being mindful of, is this inclusive? You know, do we have incentives for this? Is it doable? So again, we'll get into that too. Yeah, exactly. So employee cookbook, and I'm probably just going to end up talking about a lot of the inclusivity as I go through here. But one of the things that is critically important when it comes to wellness initiatives around healthy eating, any type of eating, food, physical wellness, is there is oftentimes very problematic language around that, and can actually do the opposite at your organization of what the hope is. So if there is going to be a company cookbook, It is making sure that there isn't any language around calories, isn't any language around like cheat day stuff, that it is very inclusive of all bodies. And I tend to see a lot of times that's sometimes not the case. And that can create a lot of, it's very problematic in terms of the language that's being used. So being very, very mindful of language in cookbooks and how it's presented. And I think that's the other piece where someone was talking about, asking about promoting the services, is doing that in a very inclusive way of, and I'll talk about some survey questions here in a moment, but you know, first off, we wanted to make sure that this is actually what people want. And so this is why we're doing this survey. And you can also do surveys where it's like, okay, here's a list of things that are potentially options. Check which ones you would want to do or not. You know, like which ones are you interested in, which ones are you not interested in. So you can get kind of an idea of that. And then when you're talking about those wellness initiatives, here's why we know it's important to see holistic from a wellness perspective. Here's why we know that wellness is critical in the workplace, because for many people, that's most of their waking hours is working. So how do we not have it feel like I'm, you know, only practicing wellness outside of work? You know, so here's why it's important. Here's how you are involved. And then here's how we are making sure it's inclusive. And there's a great question around resources surrounding that language. And I can follow up with some resources on that as well. There's a lot of resources around, you know, body neutrality and language around body neutrality, inclusive language, talking about food, all of those, talking about exercise, all of those things. So there can be employee activity clubs. In some cases, people may have like a walking club, they may have a book club, it can be anything, but some type of, you know, way for folks to come together. And that's kind of a way that there can be team building is, you know, how do we have folks come together in a way that feels not forced? You know, again, here we all are to do trust falls. No one wants to do that. Something that they are personally interested in, etc. And then those can also be a virtual one and then an in-person one. I think I mentioned this on a later slide, but I'll mention it now. I highly discourage activities that have half of the people or some people doing it in person and some people virtual. I have had HR come to me and say, we have these lunches, these staff lunches for everyone to like come together and interact. And it just feels very awkward and no one's actually utilizing it. And half the people are sitting around at the table together. And then there's like a screen with the virtual people basically like watching that. I'm like, yeah, no, don't do that. So if you're wanting to do like group activities, I highly recommend it being like there's an in-person one and a virtual one, because otherwise it gets very convoluted and no one's actually fully engaged. So there's also ERGs or employee resource groups. Sometimes there will be ones focused on certain topics like a DEIB ERG that is, they can, you know, bring in speakers. They can also find ways to integrate initiatives into the workplace. So, and if you look up ERGs, there's tons of resources online about like types of ERGs, how to start one, childcare resources, so how to help folks get connected to childcare, how to find that for them. We can help with finding childcare for people. Wellness newsletters. If you have, sometimes I encourage organizations to have a company intranet. So somewhere where they log in, it's like, here's what's going on, here's what's coming up. There could be like a live section for anonymous feedback of like, what would you want to see next? Making sure you, if possible, subsidize community education. There could be a yearly stipend for CEU credits for folks, integrating that into your yearly check-ins with people to make sure that they feel like they are continuing ed, have space to do that, that they can, and there can be like continuing ed specific PTO. So some organizations will be like, you have this many kind of like PTO hours to use for continuing education. We talked about student loans, ergonomic workstations, again, mindfulness trainings, mental health, wellness trainings, activities. Some places where people work on site, there's like a a quiet room or a Zen room, or they'll bring in like a chair massage person there for a day, mindfulness activities. Sometimes organizations at the beginning and or end of their meetings will do like a 1-minute mindfulness exercise, really just integrating that in. So it's not like, okay, we had this one-time training, it's we did that and now we've integrated in this mindfulness activity throughout. You could offer stipends or free access to certain mindfulness or wellness apps. So some of these, I would say, is just kind of a starting point. Yes, someone had mentioned at their wellness fairs, chair massages and therapy animals. Oh yes, I mean, obviously, as long as no one has any allergies, I can't say enough about therapy animals. It will change the whole vibe of any room you're in if you bring in a therapy animal. So yes to that. Okay, so some of that engagement we're talking about. How do we get people to actually do it? So talking about and having more transparency up front about wellness initiatives. So how does it come up in the interview? What do you talk about? What do you kind of upsell? Because again, as we've seen with so many statistics, again, especially with younger generations, they are looking for more holistic wellness initiatives where they work. They're looking for more flexibility. And so talking that up, being able to say, here's what we do, and we do this consistently, and this is why we see that it's important. What does your social media presence look like? Do you post if you're, if your team's doing something, or maybe someone's been volunteering somewhere, and like talking about that. So really engaging yourself in talking about that wellness, showing what your organization's doing, offer incentives. That's another thing that you can do in terms of surveying employees is what incentives would you prefer? In many cases, people are going to say money and PTO. It's like, okay, let's figure out how to do that. But find out from people what incentives actually motivate them. The other thing that I see a lot is making time to figure out when these activities happen so it does not further stress people out. So number one, I think there's more and more of a move away from having workplace activities happening outside of work hours. That is a lot to ask of people. And so unless it's a very specific circumstance, with lots of planning ahead of time and optional, obviously, I really encourage wellness activities to be during work hours and not expect people to be like, well, if you want to go to it, you're going to have to stay late. Like, I would discourage that. And the other piece is, I'll give an example of this. I was talking to an individual in HR, I think last year, and she was like, I spent months like planning a day, making all this, work, and I did a digital detachment day, and my employees are burnt out, they're exhausted. And so I took all this time to pick a day in the summer where everyone was completely detached from their computer. They weren't allowed to even turn their work computer on. And we were all just going to have this like potluck and hang out all day. And she was like, no one was happy about it. Like, yeah, I'm not surprised. So number one, when folks are super burnt out and overworked, what is not going to help them? It's going to have a day where they just have a backup of all their work and emails, right? So all that did is put a huge backlog on their work that they were just going to have to do double the work the next day. Because just suddenly one day not looking at your computer is not going to help someone feel less burnt out. It's actually going to make it worse. And then also, they were not super excited to just stand around and talk to all their colleagues as they were all just stressing about the double work they were going to have the next day. So it sounded good on paper, and this is where it's being very thoughtful. It's like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And she was coming from such a good, well-meaning, intentionally trying to be helpful place, and it was just like the worst thing we could do, to like help employee wellness or engagement or morale. And so sometimes like, okay, this looks good on paper, but I know this is a therapeutic term I use a lot, but like, let's play out the tapes. And I realize it also ages me, but I'm going to still use it. Let's play out the tapes of this initiative. It sounds good, but okay, let's actually see what the steps would look like if we actually just started implementing this right away. And that's where, again, surveying helps, but also really thinking about being mindful of how do we put our time and energy into smarter strategies. So here are some survey questions you can ask employees. Again, everyone's able to download this whole slide deck. So you can download that deck anytime if you wanted some of these as resources. So again, it's thinking, how do we ask better questions? And sometimes it's good to have a survey that is multiple choice. Obviously, that's a lot easier to get aggregate data on, but then also some room for short answer, because that's really going to give you some great information. So, what are your energies like after a day at work? Have any of your outside commitments suffered because of work? What can we do to improve your work-life balance? And I like questions like that instead of, do you have work-life balance? This kind of yes or no. We're not going to get very good answers from closed-ended questions that just ask a yes or no. Sometimes we need that, again, for clear data. But if you are having conversations with folks, it's like, what could we do? That is eliciting an actual true response. And it's also telling them, we want you to tell us that, instead of, we're hoping you just say everything's fine, right? So we want to be very mindful of how we ask our survey questions, so it doesn't feel like you better answer this the way we want you to. So ask these questions genuinely. Try to have surveys that are anonymous, or ask people in different ways. So the other thing is that sometimes HR or leadership will ask employees questions in a group setting. Not everyone's comfortable giving feedback in front of a bunch of other people. So also ask these questions in one-on-ones. Do surveys anonymously that they can type it in on their own time. So widening the way and the strategy as to how you ask the questions also helps, and can start getting better information. So some of these I've kind of touched on already, but having those kind of contingency plans, having a plan in place of what does wellness look like for remote workers and for in-office workers. And again, really trying to, avoid having a hybrid. If it feels like, because I've had this come up sometimes, that the in-office and the remote workers just like never really connect, is potentially having it be where everyone does it remote. Maybe the folks who are in office are at their desks. They're not all in the same room, but everyone's participating remotely. You can have, sometimes what teams want is they're like, there's another team at this organization that I sometimes work with, but we never really get to know them. So you could just do like those two teams do some type of activity together. It's like, hey, we know that you have a lot of crossover tasks, but never really interact that often. And we're going to have this activity or this additional kind of wellness activity in this meeting to give people space to interact more. Being mindful of physical health activities you choose. So, I've been organizations before where someone said, this is a wellness challenge, and you get, either a gift card or whatever else at the end of it, but I physically don't have the ability to do that activity, and there are physical constraints for my ability to do that. So we don't want to have that happen. So have multiple options. Make sure that you're mindful of the type of physical activities that you are encouraging people to do and offering for folks. Sometimes people still do kind of like, team building as part of their larger wellness initiative can still be like after work happy hours, being very thoughtful of including alcohol at all in terms of being inclusive. So I tend to suggest avoiding, again, many events that happen outside of work hours and that avoid alcohol. Using inclusive language around food, health, and wellness. And then also, if you are blocking out time for these activities to happen, making sure that if that is cutting into people's work time, that you are doing what needs to be done to create space for them to get those hours back. So there will be a lot more engagement and less stress in these during work hour activities when it doesn't feel like, well, now I have an hour less time to get all my tasks done because I sat through this thing. So having a strategy in place for that will really help. So they feel like they can actually be present, do the activity, and not feel like it's just taking away from the work they have to do. So there are a couple of resources here. This one is the full link on the slide I had that had the examples of survey questions. I think all of those came from this list. A lot of the ones on there are also related to mental health, but it's a really great list of questions of just like, what could we add to a survey? There are, and then these two links of just continued employee wellness program ideas. And it's a much longer, thorough list because there's so many that are out there. So I wanted to have that available. Again, you can download that whole slide deck if you want it. So let me see if there's any other questions. So someone, I know that there was also that, I kind of talked about this, but resources surrounding more inclusive language. I'm going to jump back to this slide just for a second. Around food, health, and wellness. There are trainers who, and I really encourage this in terms of employee education. There are folks that will do trainings just on inclusive language around health, body neutrality, what to be mindful of in the workplace of how we talk about things. And I think what can be helpful about trainings like that is it's also not only teaching or talking to like HR about how do we use better language in these initiatives, it's also teaching the entire employee group of here's some things to say and not say, like when you're in the lunchroom, and in trainings like that, it'll say, if there's some type of food out on the, communal lunch table and someone comes in, they're like, oh, there's no way I could eat that, it'll make me fat. Like, we do not want to be saying things like that. And so teaching employees around how to speak more respectfully around body neutrality and, promoting that and kind of removing some of that very problematic language, just conversational language, a lot of times people don't even realize they're doing. So I always encourage organizations to think about having more staff trainings on all sorts of different ways that we can be more inclusive. And then that can also in turn help on the HR level of the wording in promoting a cookbook, or health and wellness challenges. So that's another suggestion I would make around that. Let's see. Okay. So, as I said, I promised we would not go past time. And so we're not going to go past the time. So I have this slide up here. If you have us as your employee assistance program, here's a reminder of how to get a hold of us. If you don't have us as an EAP and you're interested in learning more about how we can help or our services, our main website is just canopywell.com. mycanopywell.com is our member site, but you can also call or email us with any questions you may have. There is an optional survey at the end of this. I always love to get feedback from folks. And of course, everyone will receive their certificate of attendance. That should be coming to you soon. So that's all kind of the ending housekeeping piece. But I really appreciate everybody attending today. You had wonderful suggestions and questions. I love having that engagement. And hopefully you had a good training today. And thanks again for coming, and have a good rest of your day, and take care.